Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 11 for History 101. And last time I talked to you, we were right in the middle of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention of 1787. They had just reached a breakthrough with the Connecticut Plan, or Great Compromise as it's known. And already the next controversy rose up, and that's on whether or not slaves should be counted for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. Now, this is going to cause a massive debate in Independence Hall. But don't get me wrong, the issue of slavery was not directly debated. No one got up and said, let's just save ourselves a lot of time and trouble and eliminate slavery right now, because they knew if they proposed no slavery in the Constitution, that all the Southern delegations would get up and walk out and there'd be no Constitution. Because remember, there are slaveholders at the convention. So they're going to indirectly debate it through this representation. Now, Northern delegates argued, where slavery wasn't that prevalent and was slowly but surely being phased out, that slaves should not be counted for representation purposes. Because obviously, slaves are not going to vote in this new system. They don't pay taxes. Why in the world should they be represented by members of Congress? Now, Southern delegates argued that slaves were an integral part of their society, a reflection of wealth, and a major part of their economy, and had to be counted. Now, this is a heated argument. It's going to determine the power of these states in the House of Representatives due to their representation numbers. And what's really going to change things to get them to move forward towards a compromise is going to be when one Southern delegate gets up and says, okay, you don't want to count slaves? Let's not count women either. Because are women going to vote in this new system? Obviously not. Can women even own property? No, they couldn't in all 13 states at this point. So, in reality, they're kind of hitting the nail on the head. It's a pretty fine line that divides a woman from a slave back in this day and age. But with that said, delegates like John Adams basically said, all right, let's make a deal. He knew if he brought home a constitution that didn't count women, that Abigail Adams would have his head and he'd be sleeping on the couch for the next month. So they come up with what sounds like a crazy compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, where they will, when they do the census, and the first census will take place in 1790, we do them every 10 years. We're doing one now. By the way, if you haven't gone online and filled out your census yet, do so. It's important for us New Yorkers. So, when they did the census, they would count white people in every state as, I guess, quote unquote, whole people. And they would count the slave population separately. Then each state would get 3/5 of that number as when they calculated the total population of the entire state. And that's how they calculate how many members that you send to the House. And we talked about how New York has 25 members in the House. Presently, Vermont has 1 due to population. So that's what they're doing. It sounds crazy. How'd they come up with 3/5? Well, it's halfway between a half and 3/4. But all is not lost. There are abolitionists at the Constitutional Convention, and they're going to get their own views sort of slid in at the end by the most prominent abolitionist at the convention, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is the president of the New York City Abolitionist Society. He has a very close ally, Benjamin Franklin, who is the president of the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society. And what Hamilton slides in at the very end, before he'll support the Three-Fifths Compromise, is that they must include the date of January 1st, 1808. And what can happen on that date is Congress can pass a law outlawing any further importation of African slaves into the United States. So ban the foreign slave trade. Now, this is extremely important because Congress will do that. They'll pass a law in 1806 that'll go into effect on January 1st, 1808, banning any further slaves being imported into the United States. Now, I realize they're still smuggled in, but it's against the law. And what this does is sort of cap the number of slaves in America. So from that point forward, it'll be the slaves that are here already and their offspring. Alexander Hamilton was an economic genius, as we'll find out. That's the reason why he becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury. He knows that the country's going to grow, and the demand for slaves in the South will rise as the country grows. And then demand will outpace supply. And in basic economics, what that means is then the price of slaves will skyrocket. And his belief is that sooner or later that slavery will become economically unfeasible, that it will be much cheaper to pay a field laborer than own one, because the price of slaves will go through the roof. And that's exactly what started to happen in the 1850s. There was a huge spike in the price of slaves on the auction block. We'll never know if this theory of Hamilton's would have ever came to fruition, because the Civil War started in 1861. But historians and economists that study this believe that breaking point economically for slavery would have happened sometime in the 1870s. Slavery was abolished by then, but it might have happened through economic forces. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is reached. That's another big breakthrough. Then they argue and argue over voter qualifications. Who should get the vote? They really can't agree on that. Some wanted people to own so many acres of land. Some wanted income requirements and whatnot. There were huge differences already between North and South. So what they did was they agreed not to agree. They left voter qualifications up to each individual state. And that's why we have drastically different voter qualifications state to state to state, including regulation on registration, how you vote, and so forth. That's why today, presently, there are 5 states, including Oregon, that vote entirely by mail. No one goes to a voting booth to vote. That may be the case coming this November if we're still struggling with COVID-19. There's different rules about absentee balloting, which may be the other reform option for the upcoming November election. And that's up for debate right now as to how we're going to adjust to this, but it's a state-by-state process. So that's part of the original Constitution. Now, finally, what they have to do is they have to determine how are we going to approve this document. So they have to embed the ratification process. So what they do is they know if they follow the rules of the Articles of Confederation, which technically they should have, I suppose, they just wasted their entire summer in Philadelphia. Because now we're into September, and they're going to adjourn on September 20th and leave. Because they know there's no way the Constitution will be unanimously approved, or so they think. So what they do instead is they are only going to require 9 out of the 13 state legislatures to approve the Constitution. And they're going to change the venue. They're not even going to allow the state legislatures to have the power to do it. They're going to have the states each create a process to elect delegates to a state ratifying convention. And these elected delegates then will be the ones who debate the Constitution state by state and vote yes or no on it. So they change the process completely, and that's the ratification process. So everybody packs up, leaves Philadelphia with their copies of the Constitution on September 20th in 1787. So the ratification process begins. Now, one thing we want to talk about next as far as ratification goes, once again, there's 2 contending factions politically in America that we talked about previously. The Federalists, who have had their way in Philadelphia and have created this new system, potentially, with a much stronger federal government, and the leadership of the Federalists include Hamilton and Madison. Then there's still the Anti-Federalists, who only made up about 25% of the Founding Fathers, who really still supported strong state governments. And the way I like to explain where they come from is they still are sort of having a hangover effect of the American Revolution. They still have a bad taste in their mouths when it comes to having a strong central government, which to them only reminds them of Parliament and the abuses Parliament enforced on the colonists, and also having a strong federal government reminds them of the horrors of King George III. So they want absolutely nothing that resembles him or Parliament. That's the Anti-Federalist stand. Now, these 2 groups are going to be the major forces that debate ratification of the Constitution. So what we want to do next is look in your book on page 176 in Chapter 8 here. We have a map up top, map 8-4, showing us where the different groups of Federalists, Anti-Federalists, people divided and so forth over ratification existed within the 13 states. And down below, Table 8-4 shows us the ratification of the Constitution state by state by state. So let's review a little bit here. Here's what happens. They break up in September. Then each state has to hold an election, elect delegates to attend a state constitutional convention where they will then debate the Constitution and vote yes or no on it. So if you take a look at the chart or Table 8-4, the first state to successfully do this is Delaware. By December 7th of the same year, 1787, they've done all that, debated the Constitution, unanimously voted on it and voted yes, and they're the first state to ratify the Constitution. That's why if you ever see a Delaware license plate, which you don't routinely see, especially up here in New York, the slogan of the state on that plate is the first state. This is what they're referring to. They were the first state to ratify the Constitution. Then you'll notice, very important state, third in population, Pennsylvania will ratify the Constitution just 5 days later on December 12th. It won't be unanimous, but it'll be 2-1. Then the third state, New Jersey, will unanimously ratify the Constitution on December 18th. So before we know it, before the year is even over with, we're 1/3 of the way to ratification because it requires 9 out of 13. This is when the anti-federalists have to jump into action if they have any shot at blocking ratification of the Constitution. And they're going to start writing a series of letters to the editor to local newspapers in states that are debating the Constitution. You may have never heard of these. These letters will become known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. In response to these criticisms launched against the Constitution, the Federalists have to jump into action to defend their beloved document. They will write a series of letters to the editors rebutting these arguments against the Constitution, and those papers will they'll become known as the Federalist Papers, which you probably have heard of, especially in an American government course. Now, the major authors of these papers, the three authors of the Federalist Papers who write these anonymous letters to the editor to local newspapers, are the one who writes the most is James Madison. Who better? He wrote the Constitution. He knows how to defend it. The person who writes second most is his sidekick in all this, Alexander Hamilton. And the third author, who we'll be talking about later in the Washington administration, is New Yorker John Jay. On the anti-federalist side, the most prominent of the anti-federalists is the governor of New York at this time, Governor George Clinton. Governor George Clinton will be the main author of the Anti-Federalist Papers, and he is the governor of the state of New York at that time. And what many people don't realize, he's why we're Clinton County. Our county is named after him. He was an anti-federalist and did not like the Constitution, and he was joined by other prominent anti-federalists, including the famous Patrick Henry of Virginia, a great patriot. He was also joined by another writer of the Anti-Federalist Papers, the very prominent Revolutionary War hero, General Light Horse Henry Lee. You probably have heard of General Lee before because you know about his very famous son. His son is Robert E. Lee of Civil War fame. Light Horse Lee was a cavalry leader in Washington's army in the Rev War. So those are the three most prominent of the Anti-Federalist Paper writers, and this debate will go on in newspapers all across America. Now, as you'll notice on the chart, we're going to enter the next year, 1788, and things will materialize very quickly once again. Georgia will unanimously ratify the Constitution. Connecticut will quickly follow suit in January. Massachusetts will be the 6th. And then as we work our way down, the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, which technically speaking means the document is approved, remember we need 9 out of 13, is New Hampshire. When they ratify the document on June 21st, 1788. Now, technically speaking, that's a done deal. But when you look at the chart, 2 extremely important states still haven't voted. Virginia, the largest state population-wise, by a long margin, as you can see, with 747,000 people compared to Massachusetts, 475,000. And the fifth largest state population-wise, us, New York. Now, the two constitutional state conventions are still going on in these states. The Federalists now have a target of unanimous ratification. They'd like to enter this brand new era with a unified government. So, down in Virginia, down in Williamsburg, which was the capital back in that day and age, is where the Virginia Convention is taking place. And in New York, the New York State Convention is taking place in Poughkeepsie. Now, this is when a glaring flaw in the U.S. Constitution was discovered by no less than our governor, George Clinton. Governor Clinton has read the Constitution so many times he can't remember. And it finally dawns on him what's wrong with it, a problem no one can explain away. There's absolutely no power given to the people. All the power is given to the government. Powers in Article 1 to the legislative branch, powers in Article 2 to the executive branch, and so on and so forth. No specific powers given to the people whatsoever. He finally points this out, and it's an argument against the Constitution that the Federalists have no answer for. It's more or less, you got us. James Madison down in Virginia, who was a delegate to the Virginia Convention in Williamsburg, tries to explain it away to Patrick Henry and Lighthorse Lee that they didn't include those because it would be redundant. Everybody knew what powers we had because we just fought the Revolutionary War to gain these powers. We didn't need to write them down. We all knew we had freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and whatnot. Up in New York, Alexander Hamilton doesn't try to just explain it away. He's a delegate up in Poughkeepsie, as well as Governor Clinton. He more or less admits to Clinton, you're right. But he and Clinton reach a gentleman's agreement in Poughkeepsie. He pledges that if New York ratifies the Constitution, and once this government is up and running, which will be the next year, they're going to hold an election in late 1788, because the Constitution was ratified in June, as we know, that he will do everything in his power to make sure that the brand new government takes care of this and amends the Constitution and adds our rights as Americans to it. Now, obviously, what I'm referring to, what's going to happen, and we'll study and we'll talk about in our next lecture, that's what's going to lead to the Bill of Rights being written and added to the Constitution right off the bat. So, that gentleman agreement is reached. The same agreement is reached down in Williamsburg, and as you'll notice, on June 26, Virginia will ratify. Pretty close vote, 89 to 79. New York will follow suit a month later in a much closer vote, 30 to 27. So then we'll have 11 out of the 13 states ratifying the document. Now we're going to have a couple holdouts. North Carolina is going to wait all the way till November of 1789. We're already going to have a government up and running in 1789 when they ratify it, so they're a bit tardy. But the real tardy ones are Rhode Island, who wait all the way till May 29th, 1790 to ratify the Constitution. Now remember, Rhode Island's the only state that didn't send a delegation to Philadelphia in 1787, and not many people were upset. Now, what's happening in Rhode Island is they're meeting in their state house in Providence. And rumors are swirling that Rhode Island is going to turn down the Constitution. And after they turn it down, supposedly, they're going to declare their independence and be the independent nation of Rhode Island. Now, I know it sounds like a joke, but George Washington, who will be president by this point, as we'll find out, doesn't see it as a joke at all. And he knows what they're up to. What they're attempting to do is be the independent, freeloading nation of Rhode Island. They don't want to chip in for the federal government, and they know darn well that if push comes to shove and they need to be defended, we'll be there to defend them. Plus, they're a bunch of mavericks to begin with that we talked about previously. So what George Washington is going to do is send the Continental Army up to Providence, Rhode Island in May of 1790. They'll surround the State House and send a message in. And the message will be basically, ratify it or else. If you wonder what else is, look outside the window. There, the United States Army has cannon trained on the building, and they're ready to go in and arrest everyone for treason. So, with that facing them, the Rhode Island Constitutional Convention, as you can see, barely ratifies it. 34 to 32, and they become the 13th state to ratify the Constitution. And now we finally, in 1790, have unanimous ratification. So, that's the end of this lecture, class. I'll take a short break. I'll pick up in a minute, and we're going to talk about the very first government after we talk about an interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So I'll see you shortly. Take care. Bye.